Hi, everyone. Today, I'm very excited to virtually sit down with one of the greatest announcers of all time, a personal favorite of mine. He's done every sport you can imagine. It's Kenny Albert. Kenny, thanks for joining me again. And first of all, I know it was quite a bit ago, but how were the Olympics?
Well, Aidan, great to be with you. Appreciate the kind words. The Olympics were incredible. I've been so fortunate to be involved in seven Winter Olympics now and three on the summer side with NBC. And it's always so much fun. Always a whirlwind because there are so many games and events that we're involved in a short span. But what made this year's even extra special was the fact that it was the U.S. and Canada in the gold medal game on both the men's and women's side. On the women's side, it's sort of a given that it's going to be those two countries. Seven out of the eight Olympics since women's hockey was introduced, it has been the U.S. and Canada in the gold medal game. On the men's side, you never know. There are so many other teams that could have gotten there. Just look at what happened in the quarterfinal round when the U.S. and Canada both had to go to overtime to win their games. It was the first time for the NHL players since 2014 in Sochi, so that certainly gave it an extra special feel as well. And again, the fact that it was the U.S. and Canada playing for gold and the way it played out with the United States winning, it was just incredible.
Yeah, so on the men's side of things, like you said, the NHL players getting back into the Olympics, the best on best returning. How different is that calling games in the Olympics where it's, non-NHL players versus this year when you have the best players in the world?
Right. Well, I called 24 games in 18 days in Milan, both men's and women's. And as far as the preparation goes, I remember my first Olympics back in 2002 in Salt Lake City. I was literally a last minute replacement for Doc Emmerich about a week to 10 days before the start of the Olympics. Doc had to pull out for personal reasons, and I got the call, and I was one of the two hockey play-by-play announcers along with Gary Thorne, and it was a lot of cramming and studying, and I was doing the secondary games on the men's side, but I was doing all of the U.S. games on the women's side leading up to the gold medal game, and I wasn't as familiar with the women's teams at that point. They had only been in one Olympics in '98, so a lot of studying over that week to 10 day stretch. On the men's side, it was mostly NHL players on certain countries, but a lot of the games that I did, it was not like Belarus, Latvia, and so many others. So it's always a bit of a cram session. And I've, like I said, done seven Winter Olympics now, so you get into the routine in the weeks and months leading up to it. This year specifically, on the men's side, the U.S., Canada, Sweden, and Finland were all NHL players, aside from one player on Finland. That was it. So those teams were easy. Some of them are wearing different numbers than they were in the NHL, and it's also a lot different when all of the Swedes or all of the Finns are on one team. In the NHL, you have one or two or three on every team. Now you have them all together.
Mm.
So, that's certainly a little bit of a different feel. But some of the other countries, Germany and Latvia, Slovakia, they had five or six NHL players, but the rest of their roster was not. So that was certainly a little more challenging as far as the studying, the memorizing. On the women's side, I'm so familiar with the US and Canada, having done multiple Olympics, but when you get games involving Sweden, Finland, Switzerland, and some of the other countries, for example, those certainly take a little more time as far as the studying and the names sinking in, the names and numbers. But also, once the Olympics move on, as you're going through the first week into the second week, I did a lot of the teams multiple times.
Mm.
So
Mm.
that certainly helps. And especially when we got down to those last 3 or 4 days with the women's gold medal game and then the men's semis on the Friday. The women's gold medal game was on a Thursday, the men's semis on Friday, the men's bronze medal game on Saturday, and the men's gold medal game on Sunday. Those were a lot easier because it's less teams and we had done so many games involving all those teams leading up to those final 4 days.
Yeah, some fun games, especially, of course, the gold medal games for the women's and the men's side. Obviously, there are things that you can predict that are going to happen, the players walking or skating onto the ice and all that stuff, but you can't predict how a game is going to end with all the overtime winners. Did you have something in your head that you knew you were going to say had it gone to overtime? How do you prepare for something like that?
That's a great question. And in hockey, there are so many different ways a goal can be scored. So you can't really prepare for the actual goal call. Um, During the course of a regular regulation, first, second, third period of a hockey game, it's usually 5-on-5. And there are goals at times where you're not sure. It could be a deflection off a teammate's stick, off a body part, off a defenseman's skate. So there are definitely times during the NHL season where you're not exactly sure who scored the goal, so it affects the call. There are ways to delay a little bit. You can call the goal without saying the player's name initially. You can give the score, the time, and then you kind of watch the huddle and the celebration. And usually it's the first player who skates out of the celebration that goes to the bench that actually scored the goal 99% of the time. The thing about those Olympic Games, and specifically the men's quarterfinal game against Sweden, won by Quinn Hughes in overtime, the women's gold medal game, and then the men's gold medal game, all in overtime, 3-on-3. So from a play-by-play standpoint, I was thrilled about the
Yeah.
fact it was 3-on-3 because the goal will probably come on a 2-on-1, a 3-on-2, a breakaway. Now the Quinn Hughes goal didn't. That was a setup in the zone and a shot that certainly could have been deflected, but was not. So, for me, the winning goals in the gold medal games, there was no question as to who scored those goals. But you can't really prepare the goal call because it could be any kind of a goal, right? You never know how the play is going to develop. However, prior to the men's game, over that 36 or so hour stretch leading up to the game, once we knew who the teams were going to be, I did think about it a little bit. And I'm not one that really writes out a final call or scripts it, writes out a paragraph. I've been lucky enough to work 3 Stanley Cup finals on the TV side and some other big games. But you also don't want to go in, totally naked without a thought. So sometimes I'll throw around some keywords or phrases. When I did the Tampa Bay Montreal final in 21, um, it was 3-0 Tampa Bay. They actually lost game 4, so I had a couple of days to think about it. Wound up winning the cup in game 5. And what came to mind was, because they were repeating, it was their second in a row. The phrase I used was lightning strikes twice. The Tampa Bay Lightning win the Stanley Cup. And ironically, Chris Cuthbert, who does such a great job up in Canada, I found out the next day he used a similar line. So I felt pretty good about that one. When the Vegas Golden Knights won in 23, I was thinking about it for a day or two leading up to the game. And given that their nickname is Golden Knights and the Stanley Cup is silver, the line I used was the silver trophy to the Golden Knights. So one quick line. Um, when the Panthers won last year, when they beat Edmonton, I used the words Panther perfection as the time wound down. It was a blowout, so
Mm.
you knew the result, like early in the third period, second period, even with Vegas and Florida 2 years before. Uh, it was like a 9-3 game in the third period, so it was never really in doubt. So lightning strikes twice, silver trophy to the Golden Knights, Panther perfection were the phrases I used for those Stanley Cup games. So thinking about it on the Saturday before the gold medal game, again, you don't know how the goal's going to be scored. But I wound up, and this was kind of off the cuff. I used the term golden goal
Mhm.
because, again, if the winning goal is scored in regulation, if it's a 5-1 game, you don't know which goal will be the game winner, etc. So I called the goal. Jack Hughes wins it. And then I said the golden goal for the United States, which again was a phrase used when Sidney Crosby scored the golden goal in
Mhm.
Vancouver in 2010. But then what I did think about the day before, I wanted to incorporate something about the 1980 team, the Miracle on Ice team. So the third part of the call was somewhat planned if the U.S. had won. And I said, for the first time since the miracle in 1980, the United States takes the gold. So that was the part of it that I thought about. Um, the first two, the Jack Hughes wins it, and then the golden goal for the United States, those just came naturally. On the women's side, when Megan Keller made the unbelievable play to score the winning goal, I called the goal. And then, now remember, thinking back a month ago, I'm pretty sure I said the United States wins the gold in Milan, which is somewhat similar to my line in Pyeongchang
Mm.
when they won in a shootout over Canada. The United States wins gold in Pyeongchang. But on the men's side, it was sort of a three-parter, like I said. And the third part I had thought of over the previous 24 to 36 hours.
Now, of course,
That's gonna If Canada had won, I'm not sure. Still would have been. You still have to get excited on the call.
Yeah.
So you're calling the game into the United States. To me, it almost felt instead of a U.S. Canada game, it felt more like an NHL All-Star game, to be honest,
Mm.
because
Yeah.
all the players are NHL stars, and I see them all the time. So it really had the feel of the best NHL All-Star game ever, with the top 40 players from the U.S. and Canada on the ice.
What do you make of the 3-on-3 in the Olympics? I know it got a lot of mixed opinions from a lot of NHL coaches and players and just other announcers. What are your thoughts on doing the 3-on-3 in overtime?
I think ultimately you probably don't want the game to end that way for a
Yeah,
gold medal. I understand why they do it throughout the Olympics because there are 4 games a day in the preliminary round, and they can't have games going on forever for television purposes, for the fans, getting the fans in and out of the arenas. Um, you don't necessarily want teams playing 5 overtimes, then they're
right,
might be at a competitive disadvantage in their next game. So again, I understand why they do it. When Crosby scored the goal in 2010, that was 4-on-4. So maybe that would be a little more fair, as far as quote real hockey like they
right,
play during regulation. It's been different in the women's in 2018. It was a 20-minute overtime period. Then it went to a shootout. This year they did not go to the shootout, at least in the gold medal round. They would have in some of the earlier rounds. So again, I see why they do it, but in a perfect world, you probably don't want to end the gold medal game 3-on-3. But those are the rules, and every team knew it going in. And
right.
I think if you're Canada and you have McDavid, McKinnon, Makar on the ice, you have to feel pretty good about your chances as well, because
No
those
kidding.
are players on the ice when the United States won the game.
Yeah, I mean, arguably the three best players in the world on the ice
Absolutely.
at once, and yeah, I understand the frustration, but at the same time, I mean, if Canada scores, the Americans might complain. If the
Of
Americans
course. And
score,
and Canada won their quarterfinal game in a
right,
3-on-3 overtime against Czechia. Um, the thing is, it's almost unfair that it's a one game for the gold medal. A 2 out of 3 or a 3 out of 5 would be unbelievable.
yeah,
You look back at the Four Nations last year in that championship game, the U.S. outplayed Canada, and Bennington was unbelievable, and Austin Matthews had a great chance in overtime, and then Canada won it on the
Mhm.
McDavid goal. In the gold medal game this year, I don't think you'd have an argument from anybody that Canada outplayed the U.S., and Connor Hellebuck was unbelievable, and the U.S. wins the game in overtime. So, in these one game situations with overtime, it could obviously go either way.
So my last question about the Olympics here. Obviously, you've got plenty of sports in your broadcasting arsenal, but I'm curious what your prep is like when you know you're going to be on an Olympic call for sports that you don't call as often, like water polo or volleyball.
Yeah, it's a great question. And the 4 sports that I'm mostly associated with, I mean, football and hockey are the two that I've done the longest, and those are my main gigs throughout the year, so to speak. Still do about 8 to 10 baseball games a year, and up until this year, worked about 15 Knicks basketball games every year. With the move to Rangers TV from radio, not doing as many Knicks games, so it's mostly football and hockey these days, with a little bit of baseball. But I have been lucky enough to be involved in some other sports through the years, Aiden, boxing. Like you said, at the Olympics, I've done some track and field, volleyball, water polo. The volleyball and water polo was actually done remotely off monitors
Mm.
from Connecticut. The volleyball was during the COVID era. And then these days, they don't send everybody in person. So the water polo I did out of a studio as well. Those are challenging. They're fun. I enjoy some of the other sports that I've worked. Track and field was in Rio in 2016. It was a lot of fun, but there are so many different elements to it. I had a great analyst in Tim Hutchings who really saved the day. He was the star of those shows. Volleyball, I sat down with our local high school volleyball coach in the town I live in New Jersey, and she was so gracious to give me about an hour and a half. And I said, teach me everything you know about the rules, the strategy, the history, etc. And I had a great analyst as well. The water polo was really a lot of fun 2 summers ago.
Mm.
Never knew much about water polo. I went to it once in Rio and watched in the stands. But I knew that Doc Emmerich and Pierre Maguire, two tremendous hockey broadcasters, had done water polo at some of the previous Olympics. So I watched some of those tapes. It's kind of like hockey, in the sense that you have two goalies. There are six athletes in the water aside
Mm,
from the goalies, as opposed to five skaters in hockey. So one more, but it's pretty similar. The movement, the passing. It's sort of a combination of basketball and hockey in the water,
mm.
and they have power plays, which I was excited to hear about. Uh, but I learned the rules, and again, the strategy, the history. Doc Emmerich sent me a lot of his notes. My partners were great. Tony Acevedo on the men's side, Julie Swale on the women's side, who had both been Olympic water polo players representing the United States. So um, it was fun. Would love the opportunity, to maybe do it again someday. And but those sports are challenging, but they're fun. For me, from a work standpoint, the one sport that I've done in my professional life where I felt like I had no idea what I was watching was college wrestling. I did it once. This is back in around 1994, 95. I was working down in Washington, D.C. for home team sports, doing mostly hockey, but some basketball, some baseball as well. And they did a lot of the ACC conference at the time, men's and women's college basketball, volleyball, lacrosse, soccer. And I was involved in a lot of those games. And I was assigned to college wrestling, the ACC championships, and it was down at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill.
Mm.
I studied, I spoke to an Olympic wrestler on the phone, Jeff Platnick, watched some old tapes. And luckily, I had a really good color analyst who had been a wrestler at UNC because once it started, I really felt like I had no clue.
It's always helpful to have a partner on the mic that can
Oh,
help you out with all that
absolutely.
stuff.
He
Yeah.
was the expert.
So I want to take it back to the early days of your career and even a little bit before that. Obviously, you've been around broadcasting your whole life with your father and other relatives being in the business. Was becoming a broadcaster yourself something that was always of interest of you, or?
It always was. I was never told I had to do it, was never forced to do it. Um, Growing up with a father and uncles who were longtime play-by-play broadcasters, it's really all I remember being around as a kid. Games were on television, on the radio. I would get to tag along when my uncles came to the house for special occasions. I always felt like I was listening to the first all sports radio station when everybody would get together. And my parents gave me a tape recorder for my fifth or sixth birthday, and I set up my bedroom like a studio. I had the desk and the bed in the middle and the TV on the other side, and I would call games into the tape recorder. When I was old enough, I would start bringing it to Madison Square Garden or Shea Stadium. And a huge opportunity came about in 10th grade. I was doing a lot of writing at the time for the school newspaper and the town newspaper where I grew up on Long Island. In 10th grade, a small local cable station, Cox Cable in Great Neck, which was one of the neighboring towns, for some reason decided to come to my high school to film a girls' basketball game. And the athletic director, who I knew well, introduced me to the producer. And he said, "We have two cameras, we have a production van, and that's it. We have no announcers." So I volunteered. They clipped a mic on my shirt. I sat in the second row behind the team bench and announced the game. And I got the business card of the producer, the late Roy Menton, the next day and called him on the phone. And he gave me the opportunity to broadcast probably 75 to 100 high school and local Division III college games over the next 3 or 4 years. And I would bring friends along as color analysts, and it was just unbelievable experience. At that time, high school kids didn't really have any opportunities if they were interested in broadcasting. Nowadays, a lot of the schools have broadcasting programs. You could do the public address for the morning announcements. There are broadcasting camps in the summer around the country, but back then those didn't exist. So that was huge. I felt like I got a 3 year head start doing those games for Cox Cable.
So maybe it was, I don't know if it was the basketball game or getting the tape recorder, but was there a moment that you could pinpoint where you fell in love with broadcasting? Do you remember what it felt like getting that spark for the first time?
Right. I don't think there was any one moment. I think it was just all of the above. Calling the games into a tape recorder,
Yeah.
calling the games for Cox Cable. In college, I went to NYU. We had a really good Division III men's and women's basketball program. So my friends and I called the games. I had some opportunities with internships and people that I got to know along the way. Started filling in on some New York Islanders pre and post game shows on the radio. had the opportunity my senior year of college to call four Islanders games on the radio and actually use one of those tapes, sent it around to minor league teams. And I was hired by a team in Baltimore called the Skipjacks in the summer of 1990, and they were the Washington Capitals affiliate at the time. And it was really a dream come true. Moved down to Maryland a month after I graduated and was hired to do the broadcast, but also was involved in everything in the team office, marketing, public relations, sales, which I hated. I wasn't a very good salesman, but it was a good learning experience. If they needed a player picked up from the airport or any other errand. So those 2 years, I would never trade in for anything. Just calling the games, getting the reps, 10-hour bus rides. It was just so much fun. Still have a lot of friends that I made during those 2 years. And from there, went on to the NHL, where I've now worked since 1992, going on 34 years, which is hard to believe. Started doing NFL football in 94 when a lot of us were in the right place at the right time when Fox made a crazy bid for the CBS package and they hired four young play-by-play announcers. I was one of them, along with Joe Buck, Kevin Harlan, and Tom Brenneman, who have all had Hall of Fame careers. So very fortunate to be a part of that group as well. So to get back to the original question, there wasn't really one moment. It was just
Mm.
sort of a compilation of all those years calling games into a tape recorder with nobody listening, just for the reps, and then getting to do those games for Cox Cable in 10th grade on through my freshman year of college.
And at NYU, I mean, you were quite the hockey player. I read that you scored the first goal in NYU's club history. Is that
I did.
true?
I didn't score many. Did not score many. I played club hockey in high school, pretty low level. I was a third line winger. It was a lot of fun. Had played hockey my whole life and skated since I was really young. And once I went off to college, I figured my hockey career was done, at least on the ice, until the first or second week of college. I noticed a flyer up on the wall in one of the buildings after I left class, and a fellow student was trying to start a club hockey team at NYU. So I went to the first meeting, signed up, and we played our first game a few months later. And somehow I wound up scoring the first goal against the College of Staten Island at about 1 in the morning at Skyrink, which is on the 16th floor of an office building in Manhattan at the time. And like I said, I didn't score too many more, but I did score the first, and it was a lot of fun. It was a great group of guys, and just heard from one of them yesterday, who was on the team and was the best player on the team. And I actually played against John Cooper, the coach of the Lightning.
Oh,
We
wow.
figured out many years later he was a club hockey player for Hofstra on Long Island. So great memories. And yes, it did score the first goal somehow.
Was it a nice goal?
It was a really weak wrist shot from the top of the right wing circle. I have no idea how it went in. The goalie must have been screened because this shot was from far out and it definitely was not very hard.
They all count the same, right? A goal's a goal, you
Oh
know?
yeah, I mean if I talk about it now, I could say that it was a breakaway and I did a spinorama and beat the goalie up high, top shelf, but no, truthfully it wasn't anything like that.
Fair enough. So I want to talk about 1995 when the Rangers made the transition from Marv to Kenny. How surreal was it to become the announcer for the Rangers, a team that was obviously so close to your heart for a multitude of reasons?
Right, actually we overlapped for about 3 years where he was still doing some of the games on the
Mhm.
radio. He had done Rangers and Knicks radio back in the 60s into the 70s, transitioned to TV on the Knicks side, and then did national, boxing, NBA, football for so many years, but still did the radio for the Rangers on a limited basis, probably 15 or 20 games a year. And in 94, when they won the Cup for the first time in 54 years, he was calling it on the Rangers side, and I had the call for NHL radio, which a crazy set of circumstances led to that happening. And then, but I was really happy down in Washington. I had a great bosses in DC. I was doing Capitals hockey, filling in on some Orioles and Bullets at the time, now Wizards. And it was a great situation. I love living down in the DC area. But then in 95, when Howie Rose, the great Howie Rose, who just yesterday announced that this is going to be his last season with the Mets on radio,
Wow.
and I worked with Howie as his associate producer on Mets Extra when I was in college back in 87, 88, 89. So he was a mentor to me. But he was also one of the Rangers broadcasters, so he couldn't work the finals for the NHL. So I wound up calling the 94 series. Then in 95, in the summer of 95, Howie received an offer to do television for both the Islanders and the Mets, which was really too good to pass up on his part. So I was offered the Rangers radio job, and my father was still part of the group. So even though I was the second announcer, I called most of the games. I did about 60 games that year, and we did overlap for that 95, 96 season, 96, 97. He gave it up after the 97 season, so I became the main radio announcer and actually held that spot until last year. I did Rangers radio for 29 years. And then when the great Sam Rosen retired after 40 years, I moved over to the TV side along with my partner, Dave Maloney. So it's my
Mhm.
30th year with the Rangers, the first full time on the TV side after 29 great years on radio.
And talking about that final in 94, obviously your father had quite the eventful and busy June in 1994, working both the NBA Finals and the Stanley Cup Finals. With him working Game 7 in Madison Square Garden, do you remember the first conversation you had with him after the broadcast concluded and the Rangers were finally Cup champs?
Yeah, he worked two periods of that game seven, and Howie Rose did the second period because they were both so heavily involved.
Yeah.
I just remember, seeing him after the game, and everybody in the building was kind of in shock, that the Rangers, it had been 54 years, and it was. I remember how hot it was in the building. It was June 14th, and it was just such an emotional night for everybody that was in the building that night, because not only had they not won since 1940, but they were down 3-2 to the Devils in the conference final. Mark Messier guaranteed the victory in Game 6, scored the hat trick against New Jersey. Then they had to go to a double overtime in Game 7, and Howie Rose's unbelievable call of the Stefan Matteau goal, which still resonates to this day. They had to get by that game, and then they had a 3-1 lead on Vancouver. The Canucks won the next two. Everybody thought the Rangers were going to win Game 5 on home ice, and because they lost that game, that's when I met my wife, believe it or not. We met for the first time after that game. If the Rangers had won, I probably would have stayed for some kind of a celebration. So I met my wife that night, and then they finally did it in Game 7, and it was quite the emotional night at the Garden, June 14th, 1994.
I want to hear a little bit more about that because that's one of my favorite parts of your book. Because when you explain how if the Canucks didn't win Game 5, you wouldn't have met your wife probably.
Probably not. She went to school. She went to college with a good friend of mine who does radio down in Baltimore named Jerry Coleman,
Hmm.
and Jerry and I met through a mutual friend, and then when I moved to Baltimore to do the Skipjacks, we lived in the same apartment complex area. So we became close friends to this day. And he still does a tremendous job. He does a football, a Ravens podcast, and an Orioles podcast down in Baltimore. He was good friends with my wife and two of her friends at Ithaca College. And he was up in New York during that week of June 94 to do a voiceover for another company. And they all wound up getting together for dinner. And then I met them after the game at her apartment. They were all still there. So he didn't necessarily, plan it that way. I just happened to meet him up at her apartment after the game, and then I went back to DC. I was living down there, and we wound up somehow connecting about 6 months later, and went to lunch in New York. And I guess the rest is history at this point, 32 years later.
I love it. It's a great story. It's really a fantastic story when you think about it. Tell me more about. I want to know about your experience working with another legend of the game, Doc Emmerich. Not only what it was like to work alongside him in the business, from being his statistician for a couple of years, and then obviously filling in for him in a Stanley Cup final. Just what was it like working with him alongside him?
I learned so much. Doc is the absolute best, the best ever to do hockey, and he also did some NFL football and other sports, which people might not remember. But I first met Doc when he was one of the fill-ins on Ranger Radio back in the late '80s, and I did the stats for him. And he was such a big supporter early in my career. I would send him tapes when I was working minor league hockey in Baltimore, and he would always take the time to listen and give me some advice. And then we sort of became colleagues. Once I moved on to the NHL, and then when I worked that first Olympics filling in for Doc in 2002, and then we were at the Olympics together in 2006, 10, and 14. So we would share research material, we would share pronunciations. So we became really close, and always enjoyed watching Doc's games, uh, whether it was on the national side or when he was working for the Flyers or the New Jersey Devils. And Then we became colleagues with the NHL and NBC for about 10 years. So a great teammate. Still keep in touch with him to this day. He sent me a really nice text after the gold medal game, and just a tremendous person. As great as an announcer as he was, and I think he won 6 or 7 straight Emmys for play-by-play. He was an even better person and still is. So just a legend in the business.
At what point did you At what point did you know that the plan was in place that you would take over for Doc after his retirement? Is that something you always knew was perhaps going to happen, or was that sort of a last minute thing?
Yeah, I knew it was a possibility once they moved me to the conference final in 2014. Sam Flood and the executives at NBC asked me to do the conference final, the Kings Blackhawks, as it turns out. Alec Martinez scored the overtime winner to send the Kings into the final, as I'm sure you remember very well.
Of course.
And then I did fill in for Doc on game one of that Stanley Cup final when he had a family funeral to attend. Then I did the rest of that series on radio for the Rangers. But starting with that 2014 season, I was working the other conference final. I would work some of the All-Star events along with Doc. He would call the game. I would call the All-Star Saturday, the skills competition,
Mm.
etc. And then prior to that 2021 season, it was a weird time. It was the COVID years, and in 2020, he didn't go to the bubble. I went to the bubble in Edmonton and called about 35 games in August and September of 2020, and Doc did the final remotely from his house in Michigan. He actually called the final remotely, and then the next year, when he announced his plans and retired, that's when I took over. That was actually the last year of NBC hockey, and I called the final. And then Eddie Olczyk, Keith Jones, and I moved over to TNT, and then Brian Boucher joined us 2 years later when Keith became the president of the Flyers, and we've called the Stanley Cup final in 2023 and 25 on TNT.
When you're doing games on TNT and you get the Rangers, how do you deal with maybe perhaps earlier in your career you dealt with this more, but how do you remain unbiased when you're calling a team like the Rangers on a national stage?
Yeah, it's a great question. When I do football, it's always a national game, so you're
Right.
50-50 no matter what. Baseball, the same thing. Hockey, during the NBC years, similar situation. I did NBC NHL games for about 12 years, and whenever the Rangers were involved, I had to remind myself you have to get just as excited when the opponent scores and you have to call the game 50-50. It's not that hard. I'm so used to it. Doc did it all those years when he was
Mm.
the voice of the Devils. Joe Buck was the voice of the St. Louis Cardinals for many years, and he called their playoff and World Series games on Fox. So you just learn as a professional how to handle those situations.
Now, I want to move slightly away from hockey here when I think of one of the most incredible and underrated feats in broadcasting history back in 2009 when you covered four different sports in 4 days, NFL, MLB on Sunday, NHL Monday, NBA on Wednesday. How did you prep for that? And how did you manage that with your voice? How do you stay up to date with all that? That was such an incredible feat.
First of all, with the voice, I really have no secrets, no tricks, knock on
Okay.
wood. I do eat a lot, suck on a lot of Hall's cough drops, but
Yeah.
try to drink a lot of water. I'm not really a coffee or tea person. A lot of Diet Cokes, big Diet Coke
Okay.
guy. I will have tea if I am feeling it a little bit in the voice, but no real tricks as far as the voice is concerned. I've been real fortunate, Aiden, to be involved in so many different sports. And when I was filling in on the Knicks for about 15 years, as I mentioned earlier, before the move to Rangers television, I had countless stretches where I would have 3 sports in a week in October, November, December, where I would have football on a Sunday, Rangers during the week, and then a Knick game here and there. So that happened a lot. The stretch you mentioned, it was a fourth added in with baseball, with the baseball playoffs. And there was one stretch, I think around 2018 or 19, where I also had a boxing match in October. So I had like 5 sports in the span of about 19 days. Um, as far as the prep, I always try to work ahead. I have a checklist that I go through before each and every game, no matter if it's a preseason game or the Olympic gold medal game. And it involves a lot of reading, pouring through notes, statistics, going to practices, talking to coaches, players, listening to press conferences, preparing my charts with statistical information and anecdotes. So it's pretty similar. Football, as I'm sure you know, takes the longest time, the longest amount of preparation, because it might be two teams you haven't seen all season, and there's 50 plus players on the roster. Once you start getting into the NHL season, you're seeing a lot of the same teams. I'm around the Rangers all the time, so the volume of prep isn't what it is for football specifically. But for some reason, I've found that when all the sports are going on at once, and I have three or four sports in a short time span, I'm just locked in and focused, and it's almost easier. I get a lot of work done on planes, hotels, Ubers, taxis. Just try to get ahead with it and get it done. You're still reading articles that day and updating statistics,
Mhm.
but I found during the Olympics, I would have double headers a lot of days and four teams one day and four different teams the next day. So I would get back from the 9, 10 p.m. start at like 1 in the morning, do about an hour of work until 2 a.m. for the next day, go to sleep, wake up about 9, have breakfast, do 2 more hours of work. So it was that constant cycle during the Olympics as well.
I mean, I guess it's the work hard, play hard. You get to do all that prep, and you get to call some really fun games. Obviously, a
Yeah, I
lot
mean,
of different sports.
there's so much work and travel involved, but I
Yeah,
never look at it as work. It's fun.
it
I'm,
is.
I'm watching sports, I'm reading about sports. So even though there's a lot of work involved, I realize how
Yeah.
lucky I am doing what I love.
I agree. I mean, that's even as a student broadcaster, right? We say we get the best seat in the house, and it's always fun to be a part of it. Like you said, it doesn't feel like work. It is fun all the time, and you get to see some really great games. It's
Oh,
really an
I'm
amazing profession.
very lucky to be involved, for as long as I have. And when I think back to some of the moments, I guess it's the hard work that you put in that leads to those moments. I try never to take a shortcut, because again, and I've talked about this with Mike Tirico and Ian Eagle, some of the other great broadcasters who are friends of mine, and we've talked about the preparation and the fact that a lot of us still do it by hand because it just sinks in when you write stuff down. And I
Yeah.
remember Mike Tirico saying to me one time, you know, what else are we doing that we can't devote the time to the preparation? It's such a big part of it, and there's a lot of redundancy to it during the prep, but I feel like it's very important.
Just a couple questions left here. I'm curious about this. The common question for broadcasters or athletes is to ask what players they would put on their Mount Rushmore of athletes. I want to know what four moments from your career would be on the Kenny Albert Mount Rushmore.
Well, I've been asked oftentimes about the top games I've called, and
Yeah.
it's probably hard to narrow it down to four, but I'd have to put these Olympics as a whole. I don't want to take up two spots with the two gold medal games.
Yeah.
So, um, if I could put the Olympics as a whole with the men's quarterfinal overtime win, the women's gold medal game, and the men's definitely on one of the spots. I'd have to put the Rangers in 1994 winning the cup, and I was on the call, age 26 for NHL radio. The Bautista home run
Yeah.
is one that I get asked about very often back in 2015. And the Ovechkin record-breaking goal last year. That would certainly have to be up there. Now, I'm leaving out a lot of hockey moments,
Of
Stanley
course.
Cups. I'm leaving out a lot of football moments. So if I had an honorable mention column, football wise, I did a great playoff game in 2012 between the Saints and the 49ers, four
Mhm.
touchdowns in the last 4 minutes. I worked a Sugar Bowl with Howie Long and Terry Bradshaw. So for me, that was a personal highlight getting to work with those guys. Um, I worked that crazy play in the Raiders Patriots game a few years ago with the laterals at the end of the game. I had Terrell Owens stomping on the Cowboys star with the 49ers. I had Michael Vick's incredible 40 plus yard run in overtime. I had the Victor Cruz 99-yard touchdown catch against the Jets. I did one Super Bowl, the international feed, the world feed of Super Bowl 46, the Giants and Patriots. So a lot of other events would be in the honorable mention column, but I think if there were a Mount Rushmore with four, it would have to be the Olympic gold medal hockey games this year, and the women's gold medal game in 2018, if I could
Mhm.
add that one as
Yep.
well. The Rangers winning the cup in '94, the Bautista home run, and the Ovechkin record-breaking goal. That's a great question.
I mean, obviously, we can have the long honorable mention section because you've called so many great games, so many great moments. The Ovechkin moment. Have you ever been in an arena where, I mean, it was an away game for the Capitals, but it felt like a home game when he scored that goal. Even Islander fans we're celebrating. Have you ever seen something like that?
Probably not. I mean, I guess I've been in buildings where, back in the day, Michael Jordan playing against the Knicks and the appreciation that the fans had for him. Um, maybe other situations with players in their last game somewhere, but I was also at the Cal Ripken game as a fan when he broke the record, but that was a home game, so that was different. Um, no, that was something, to watch how the Islander fans reacted and appreciated history. And, Aiden, as broadcasters, we get so lucky sometimes. Uh, Quinn Hughes doesn't score the overtime goal if Sweden's Mika Zibanejad doesn't tie the game with a minute and a half left.
Mm.
Um, if the women's gold medal game and the men's gold medal game ended 5-1, nobody remembers the calls. If certain things didn't happen before the Bautista home run. And in the Ovechkin game, we were assigned that game on TNT a couple of weeks before when it looked like he might be around the record. And I'm watching the Capital Chicago game in a hotel room in Atlanta Friday night when Ovechkin's two shy of tying the record and three
Mm.
shy of breaking. And he scores two goals. And all of a sudden, he could break it on home ice. And Chicago pulls the goalie, but he doesn't want to break it on an empty net goal to his credit, so he stays on the bench. But then after his teammate Ryan Leonard scored an empty net goal, Ovechkin comes back out in the final minute and has three shots on goal. And Spencer Knight, fortunately for us in the broadcast crew, saved all three because if one of those goes in, we don't call the record breaking goal. So we got very lucky in that situation as well.
Amazing. And my final question for you, Kenny, as a student broadcaster who works alongside many other student broadcasters, what is the biggest piece of advice that you would have to the younger generation of aspiring broadcasters?
Well, I have spoken to so many young broadcasters through the years at the high school and college level.
Mhm.
And my advice is basically it's more than one piece of advice, but get as much experience as possible. Take advantage of all the reps you can get at college radio stations, doing a podcast, college television, and go out of the comfort zone a little bit. If your favorite sport is hockey, do basketball, do baseball, do football, do lacrosse, do soccer. Work in some of the other areas, not just play by play. Work as a host, a reporter, an interviewer, a producer, a statistician, just to get the experience because you never know what opportunities might come out of that in the future. And also never say no because you never know what an opportunity might lead to. So those would probably be the best pieces of advice that I can give.
I love it. Well, Kenny, thank you so much for taking the time out of the busy schedule to do this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Aiden. Great questions. Really enjoyed it. And let's do it again.
All right, sounds good. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. My name's Aidan Michaels, and this is Kenny Albert.